And ladies and gentlemen, later we will begin our panel discussion of today, and I'd like to ask our staff to please prepare the stage. So this morning, many experts have touched on the topic regarding the outlook of offshore wind development in Asia Pacific, and now we will move on to a panel discussion to reflect on how we can maximize the potential of the Asia Pacific region. And now I'd like to welcome our moderator of the panel. Please welcome Managing Director of World Forum Offshore Wind, Mr. Gunnar Herzig, to once again come up stage. Welcome. And next, let's welcome our panelists. First of all, please welcome Country Manager of Iberdrola Renewables International, Mr. Kevin Liu. Regional Lead of Asia Development at Northland Power, Ms. Beth Wattleworth. Global Head of ABC and Compliance, CORIO, Mr. Ken Gazzaway. Head of Engineering, APAC RWE, Ms. Tania Moreira. Please welcome our panelists to come up stage and take a seat. Welcome. And Mr. Herzig, the panel is yours, please.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, I hope you can hear us okay. Perfect. Yeah, have a seat, everyone. Great. Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for being on the panel today. And yeah, for the next kind of hour or so, the idea would be to talk a bit about the future of Asia Pacific and what we can expect, what might be some of the challenges. And maybe let me start with a bit of a general question, maybe for Tania first, but then happy to get everybody's views. And so maybe one question on the next big thing we can expect in the Asia Pacific region. Tania, you already elaborated on some of the new technologies we might see in the Asia Pacific region. But yeah, we also heard about some of the new markets that we might see in addition to Taiwan, Korea, Japan or so. Any views on what you think will be really important, let's say until 2030, whether it's a new market, a new technology, combination, anything that you feel is going to be very important for Asia Pacific over the next couple of years?
Yeah, thank you, Gunnar. I think I touched quite a touch base on during my presentation, and I definitely think that moving forward, we'll say I still strongly believe on the Taiwanese market. We are also very active in Japan, Korea, and we see new markets coming up, with Vietnam, with South Asia in general, and also Australia coming up very strongly. We see that, and I think the opportunity is there. I think there will be a lot of new projects, but it's really, really important, and I think we have said that quite a few times about collaboration and how we can move on, especially in terms of supply chain, in terms of being country-specific, but moving more at the APAC level, so we can work collaboratively as we are doing that in Europe now. You see more and more countries collaborating in Europe, and we definitely need that to see the bigger thing. So for me, it's the same word, teamwork, collaboration, and partnerships, because we can only succeed if we do that together. So we tend to partner on our projects with, local companies, but also international developers. But it's very, very important to look at the markets that are coming up. I strongly believe that there is a massive opportunity for us here to succeed. And Beth was saying about the challenge, and I believe that the APAC is challenged, but it's also very good fun, and that's why I have been here for the last 10 years, and I hope to continue for the next 10. So we have a very good opportunity here, and if we work together, if all of you, I have touched base a little bit about the innovation that we are looking forward for floating to take from demonstration into commercial scale projects. If we think outside the box, If we look at opportunities more than challenge, and the challenge is there, yes, but we need also to look at the opportunities ahead of us. And if we work together, we definitely, I'm an engineer, so I'm always thinking about outside the box. You know, what is the next innovation? What's the R&D ahead of us? How can we push the technology forward? How can we look at, you know, industrialization? So I think APAC industrialization, we are talking a lot about, and you know, our previous speakers also mentioned that about we are competing on a global scale. So fortunate or unfortunate, depends on the viewpoint, the industry is growing exponentially at a very, very rapid pace. So we need, how can we work together with the supply chain? So I think the opportunities are there. I think there are lots of, you know, we have the wind resource in Taiwan. The wind resource is really, really good compared to Japan, Korea, but how can you leverage that? How can we work with the supply chain to push the cost of fabrication down? How can we make it, you know, back to the industrialization, the jigsaw approach that I always mention. I think it's really important that, especially on the supply chain, that we move away from, okay, I can fabricate, I can produce, I can have the steel, I can cut it, roll, and welding. How can I work with the tier twos? How can we bring everything together to assembled sites and work it on serial production so we can push the cost down of the I think that's, for me, it's what I'm seeing. I think the markets are there. I think APAC market is very, very, you know, challenge, but with a huge opportunity ahead of us. And if we work together with the government in terms of policies, you know, streamline the process and being a little bit more realistic in what we can deliver. And if we work together with the supply chain, we definitely can be successful. And that's how I see, I think APAC is still a very good market for all of us. Yeah.
Perfect, great, thanks very much, Tania. Anything you would like to add, or anyone on the kind of next big thing in Asia, whether it's new markets, new technologies, anything, any thoughts on that?
And building on what Tania said, I think one of the key challenges is, of course, and we're all aware of it, this supply chain is very constrained. It is an increasingly competitive global market where there are scarce resources, and we don't have the interaction with all of the suppliers that we can. You mentioned the tier one suppliers. I think the biggest problem that we're going to face is that everybody in the market, all of the big players, want to reserve their capacity with the tier one suppliers. And the tier two suppliers are often brought in, and then there's the tier three. There are going to be numerous layers of the supply chain that have yet to be fully engaged. And we really need to tap into those resources. A lot of the ones that we're considering, the tier twos and the tier threes, are ones that maybe aren't necessarily already specialized in offshore wind. They haven't really dealt with our industry that much. Part of that is because we're a relatively nascent industry, but they already have the skills and the knowledge and the access to the raw materials that we need, and we need to start working with them more closely. Now, I'm a lawyer, so apologies in advance for that, but as a lawyer, I do have a little bit of reservation of dealing with tier two and tier three because they haven't yet dealt with the international level players. They don't have the same degree of governance frameworks that we expect to see. And that's something that we really have to partner with the tier two and tier three supply chain members so that we can bring them up to speed and get them, and make sure that we're scaling what our expectations are, so that we're talking to them in a way that is suitable for their level. You know, a manufacturer that has, you know, a small facility that can certainly help support our industry and our businesses may only have, you know, one single facility and employ, you know, 200 people. They're not going to have the same risk profile or governance structure that we would expect to see from a global multinational player. But that doesn't mean that we can't expect them to come along for the ride and learn a little bit from us. But it is all about partnerships, working with the people further down the supply chain, because otherwise we're not going to have the resources. We have these massive pipelines and we have this exciting future ahead and these amazing targets that are being set by the governments, but we won't be able to reach them with the existing resources if we solely rely on the tier one suppliers. And so it's up to us to start working with them, to start engaging with them, especially when it comes to the local employability. The local resource is a very key aspect of a lot of the scoring mechanisms that go into how our bids are assessed. And we can't achieve the local content if we're only going to rely on a certain subgroup of suppliers. And I'm from Southeast Texas originally, sorry for that. But where I live, it's oil and gas. But there's a burgeoning market that's looking to be developed there for offshore wind. And you know, when I tell people at home that I work for an offshore wind player, they look at me and smile and nod because they know they're oil and gas people. And I used to work for KBR, so I have a little bit of oil and gas, and I was born and raised there, so it's in my blood, probably quite literally. But there's a whole group of people that are happy to work on whatever you give them. And we need to work on that. We need to understand the local resource of employability, the local resource of capacity, so that we can expand the scope of the people we're playing with.
Great, thanks very much. And maybe building on that, next question for Kevin. Ken mentioned the massive pipelines that we see in Asia Pacific, in the kind of existing markets, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea, but also, yeah, hopefully in future markets like the Philippines, Vietnam, Australia, maybe. And given those supply chain restrictions that we might see, do you think a sort of prioritization might be necessary where certain markets are being prioritized by developers, or can we do all at once by strengthening and expanding the supply chain? Any views on the kind of, yeah, a rollout of all those different markets in the APAC region?
Yeah, so we certainly prioritize. I mean, for Iberdrola, in terms of offshore, we're in Japan, Taiwan, and Australia because we need to prioritize. I think the supply chain needs to catch up. I would personally like to see turbine OEMs slowing down a little bit with making turbines bigger every year so that the market can catch up, bigger vessels, bigger cranes, fabricators catching up with the capacities. But indeed, prioritization needs to happen. And I think all of us have an internal mechanism to review our CapEx allocations every year, whether that's for a medium to long-term period or looking at our financial strength, looking at our financial health. And, you know, in that respect, we certainly need to prioritize. I think we're in Taiwan, we're in Japan, we're in Australia, because we believe fundamentally that we can make money from operating an offshore wind farm in these markets.
Perfect, thanks. And maybe just a quick question to the rest. The fact that you might want turbine manufacturers to slow down a bit on growing turbines. I mean, a couple of years ago, that was always what we wanted. Bigger turbines, the bigger the better. But would you kind of support the feeling that maybe we just kind of stop the growth process and figure out how to deal with the current generation of turbines? Yeah, go ahead.
But there's just switch. I'll do this. It's great. Sorry. Maybe I'll just build on what both Kevin and both Ken had said as well. I think what the supply chain needs is it needs the clarity and the commitment that projects are going to happen. So they build the turbines around knowing when projects are coming online. They know when they're going to come at the right time, and so they design with that in mind. And I agree, it's ever changing each year, which means you're changing on the project and you're changing, you know, maybe your environmental assessments have to change to match the turbines that change. But we need to give clarity. We talk about large development pipelines, and what we mean is everybody's spending money on the same location. Everybody's spending money on the same dots. The only winners are usually survey companies and consultants, right? Sorry to all the consultants in the room, but you are probably working on the same sites as other people. And I think when you actually start to narrow down who is winning, who has that site, who is committed to this timeline, the supply chain and those tier 1, 2 as well, they can develop knowing who's going to be their end customer. I think right now it's still so vague as to, you know, building out pipelines across the region that the supply chain doesn't quite know where to go. It doesn't know whether it should run down to Australia because there was an auction. It doesn't know whether it should back every EBL that's coming out in Korea. So I think there's a consolidation around the projects, as in getting them awarded fast, getting them awarded very carefully to be able to give the supply chain a little bit of room to breathe and to grow where it needs to. Because otherwise we're all kind of chasing our tails a little bit. So, yeah.
Perfect, thanks. Anything, Tania or Ken, you'd like to add?
I totally agree with Beth, especially regarding the engineering. As I'm an engineer, we keep deploying flighters and doing SI campaigns. I believe Fugro is very busy, and the PDE in Taiwan as well. I think that definitely needs a little bit more thinking, so we don't, all work in the same sites, because it is a waste of resource, definitely. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And then maybe next question for Beth. Beth, in your presentation, you talked about the necessity to define success, to kind of get also the cooking recipe right for markets. Would you kind of be able to define success for Asia Pacific until 2030? What we would want to see for the broader Asia Pacific region to be a successful offshore wind market as a whole?
Thanks, Gunnar. I was worried you were going to ask me to cook, so I was like, oof, not right now. Bruno, no, late. No. So, I mean, the definition of success has to be operating offshore wind farms. I mean, not the development pipelines. Like, this is what each of the countries has an inherent need for. They don't have an inherent need for the pipelines. They just need the power on. The BOE was speaking about real tangible targets. Japan is, Korea is, Australia, Vietnam, Philippines. They have growing energy demands. Anywhere that has an electricity demand that's increasing, we need to look at if they have the technical capabilities to deploy offshore wind and support them in doing that. That way we don't have them running straight to fossil fuels and oil and gas, and they have a way to start decarbonizing right from the start. So the policy is really important. And then basically, I think it's important that we now act as a region. So I think it's quite unusual that we look at Europe, and we call it Europe, but they're all so different. Every market is so different. But when we actually look at Asia, there's so many similarities in the business culture. We need to make Asia look attractive. Again, back to the supply chain. If it's easier for them to stay in their home market and develop all the projects that are there, why come all the way over to Asia where it's a little bit more complicated or seems a little bit different? So how can we make it consistent? How can we make, understanding the regulatory system in each of the countries, have they got the same base? Is the EIA the same way of doing it? Is a certification the same way? Is the way you go and survey and get a vessel the same way, or the content the same way? Is there some sort of similarities that it would mean that as a supplier or as a developer, owner, operator, you look at Asia and you think, I can be in these markets. And of course, like Kevin says, we have to prioritize. We're going to prioritize on different ways that we all have strengths in our development companies. We all quite different. We all want to do the same thing, but we do it different ways. So there's going to be a bit of diversity. But to unlock this, the success of offshore wind in Asia, I think we need to treat ourselves as a region. We're just so much stronger together with that continuity. So, yeah.
And maybe a follow-up question. So what would that kind of practically mean, working as a region? Would that mean kind of asking politicians from Japan, Korea, Taiwan to kind of connect or...
Let's lock them in a room a little bit. Oh, maybe that's not allowed. Sorry, the legal's here. We'll just check. But, I mean, if you take the MOTIs, the METIs, the MOEAs, and take some of the European countries as well that maybe have already had some, success, but also some failure. You can learn so much from something going wrong. And whether that's an auction system or a permitting market, that it didn't quite work, putting those people together means that Asia can jump ahead in the experience curve. It doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, it can take those learnings. And I think it's the ministries of energy and economics that can actually say, how did you run an auction that gave you 15 sites in a year? Or how did you speed up an EIA but didn't compromise the environmental side? Or how did you get around certification? I think these are kind of key permits and key constraints that if they just get together, and again, with European countries, even like Scotland, which ran an auction for a huge number of sites in one go, yet Japan is doing 2 or 3 a year. How can they learn from each other? But locking them in the room might be a good start. But also organizations like yourself, WFO, JWPA, TOEA, other industry bodies. I think it's our job to also share that knowledge, in a plain sense. It's not developers with a developer interest. It's people with an interest in making these countries deliver their goals.
Perfect. Thanks very much. And maybe building on what you said about opportunities to make use of some of the lessons learned from Europe for the APAC region. Maybe next question for Ken. yeah, what would that kind of mean that APAC can benefit from avoiding some of the mistakes that Europe has done for new upcoming tenders or processes in the APAC region? Kind of, yeah, what opportunities would be involved in that position?
So I think one of the key things that we can all agree on is that the whole process takes too long. And, you know, you talk about what is the vision of success. The vision of success is delivering electrons, getting electricity to people. And we can't do that until things are done right. And we want to make sure things are done right. As a lawyer, again, everything must be done right. But there's a lot of things that we can learn from our past successes, our past failures, on things that we can do better. Speeding up the permitting process is key. The American Clean Power Association estimates that for US projects, from inception to the beginning of the actual project, the beginning of the actual surveys, it takes over 4.5 years before you can get the initial permits to start the process. That's insane. It should not take that long. And that's one of the things I think that APAC has an advantage of being able to learn from the mistakes that have been done in the US and in Europe, and understand that we can improve things. We can do things better. We can do things more streamlined. And we're seeing some fruitfulness of that wave of looking to try and work things through. You know, in the Philippines, President Marcos signed Executive Order 21, which required the agencies to really look at their processes and speed them up, to have an electricity one-stop shop, which is a great idea. In India, the National Institute for Wind Energy is going to serve as the focal point for all of the various federal permits that are required. And all of these variety of government stakeholders will never go away. We will always have to deal with multiple institutions, multiple departments, multiple divisions, and that's just part of what we do. But there's a way to centralize that. And I think that we're starting to see that wave, that willingness, that in APAC in particular, where there is, I think you don't have as much the groundswell of opposition to progress for our projects. The people are on side, and I think that that's a huge advantage. You know, again, coming from Southeast Texas, where people are very suspicious of the concept of offshore wind, and you know, how are you going to take good jobs away from those hard-working oil workers? When in reality, you know, people don't just need to understand we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to deliver electrons. We're all trying to make sure that we can deliver power to people in an effective and an efficient way, but without actually negatively impacting the environment. And that's our end goal. And I think that that's something that APAC has already sold to the people. The people understand that. And that's a huge advantage. You know, where even in the UK, where I'm also proud to say that I live, people generally get it, and we recently, you know, finally had, you know, more power generated from wind than from any other resource, and that's fantastic. But there's still massive amounts of skepticism. There's still massive amounts of people who don't want to interfere with my view off the shore. Fine. So we'll start looking at floating, which is a little bit further off and you won't ever see it. Fine. Well, no, we still don't like it because we don't know about it. Well, that skepticism is not something that we see in APAC, which is a huge advantage. And so not having to convince people in the first instance gives the politicians the prerogative, the right to actually start saying, okay, we don't need to convince people that this is right. Let's figure out how we can do this more efficiently. So looking at the permitting, the CFD process in the UK, fine, it worked, sort of, but it took forever. It's such a lengthy process. And we can look at those lessons learned of what we did wrong in Europe and what we are doing wrong in the United States. And because you already have the political flexibility and the political willpower behind the people, there's a lot more opportunity here in APAC than I think we see in other regions.
Great, yeah. Anything anyone wants to add on kind of avoiding mistakes from Europe or lessons learned from Europe which can be applied to Asia Pacific?
I mean, there's a huge amount Europe can learn from this region in terms of streamlining some of the processes that we just spoke about. I think it was Beth, you mentioned grid connection being super uncertain in many parts of Europe. I mean, we struggle to get a grid connection in the UK, right? And that's why projects take forever. I actually think Taiwan's got a pretty decent system going on in terms of that availability, long-term visibility of grid connection. The EIA process is a little bit complicated, but it's actually fairly short compared to most European markets. So I think the learning is certainly mutual.
Absolutely, yeah. No, great point. Excellent. And yeah, maybe let's move on to the finance side of things, because as we heard from KPMG earlier today, with interest rate levels rising, kind of what does that mean for offshore wind farms, since commonly, or many projects have 80% debt financing. So is that something you feel the industry needs to be concerned about, or is that something we'll handle well, or is that kind of be specific in Asia Pacific and different in the rest of the world? Any views on kind of interest rate levels rising and that what that means for financing offshore wind farms? Maybe, you want to go ahead and then...
Sure. So I guess it depends on where you're talking about specifically. I think some of the European markets, and certainly the United States, will kill for interest rates in Taiwan and Japan right now, right? I think the challenge is twofold. Firstly, we're not really seeing renewables moving into the corporate debt market as we should be doing. So corporate bond issuances are still the overwhelming kind of choice, if you like, or the preferred choice for a lot of large infrastructure projects in Europe and in the United States. I mean, project finance is certainly there. But really that's off the back of long-term confidence. Insurers, who are normally the go-to buyers for corporate debt, are very, very active in the infrastructure market in Europe and in the United States, whereas they're still catching up, whether in terms of the risk appetite or the understanding of the market in many parts of Asia. So I think the corporate debt market is something that we need to look at. There is a lot of reliance on project finance at the moment in these markets, but again, that can't be the only solution for long-term financing. So it goes back to the point really about balancing long-term exposure in terms of interest rate with how you can prove that you can actually make money from operating offshore wind. I mean, we are, I think, as an industry, pretty good at forecasting wind for the next 25 to 30 years. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this, right? So you kind of know based on a PPA, whether it's variable or indexed or fixed, how much money you'll be making every year, right? How much revenue you'll be taking in every year from an offshore wind asset. So the only way to make a margin attractive to financiers is by reducing your long-term O&M costs, right? So you can start to build a long-term margin into your business. And I don't think the financial industry is really quite seeing that yet. So if you go back to the point about long-term interest rate, I think all of us have different ways of hedging against interest rate exposure. But at the same time, there is a mismatch between how the risk of offshore wind is being perceived and priced.
And maybe actually follow-up question on that, especially kind of corporate PPAs, because we're now seeing more and more industrial off-takers in certain markets around the world, where it's kind of retail companies, the tech companies, and chemical companies who bought kind of long-term PPAs in some of the European offshore wind project. Is that something you guys would also see in Asia over the next couple of years? Maybe, Beth, and then...
Sorry, we'll just have to keep switching around. Thanks, Ken. I actually think the offtake industry is so exciting how quick it's moved. I mean, the purpose of an offtake originally from governments is to help create the market. So to help create some of that infrastructure that's needed and get the attraction and bring in the developers. And we've seen that across all the markets here in Asia already, how quick those subsidies and incentives move away at the point where they've started to develop the industry. Maybe in some markets still a little bit too soon. I think the drops we saw in the Japanese feed-in tariffs maybe haven't yet come through into the supply chain, but it does open up for the corporates to be in there. And I think what's exciting is the really large corporates in the tech industry that are mandating their supply chains as well. So, we all are aware of Apple or the RE100 commitments, which is forcing it down the supply chain as well to try and meet commitments and to be part of sustainable products or sustainable industries that are going forward. The challenge will come with aggregating or the bankability side, exactly as Kevin was saying, is we might know what our offtake is, but have the lenders, as the insurers, is everybody comfortable with it? So that's still going to take some time. I still believe in that as the projects reach financial close and they secure what I would say is some aggregated options and again, just some creative solutions, which I think we're starting to see, and we will see more in Taiwan as well. Then there'll be, as more projects reach FC, then, it's it will bring the industry along with it. I think the government policy, the goals are so clear to be delivered that, you know, lots of locals, local banks, local companies will get involved, and that will inevitably see us through these times. So, yeah.
Yeah, great, very interesting. Any other views on corporate PPAs we might see in the APAC markets? Ken.
Yeah, I tend to think that it's probably something that we are just getting to the point where we're understanding the opportunities that are there. Because as interest rates rise, corporates are just as attuned to those risks as we are. And in many ways, having a corporate PPA helps them to secure a stable resource that they need at a flat rate, and it helps them hedge against other interest rate risks that they face in their everyday balance sheet risks. And so having us as an opportunity that is a stable source of electricity, we get a stable rate of return on what we're providing to them. That in turn goes back to the market and sends to the market, to the finance market, that we are a viable option and that we aren't as sensitive to demand because we have a consistent demand. And corporatizing what we do is, you know, often sometimes seen as something that, you know, are we involved in greenwashing? You know, the big risk is whether people are going to oversell how green their electrons really are. And we have an obligation to ensure that we're explaining these things properly and that we're not overselling what we're doing. But having a corporate PPA gives us that stable revenue. It helps them offset and hedge against interest rate risks, and it gives us the opportunity to genuinely participate in the initiatives that we keep seeing with investors. We have, you know, lots of institutional investors. You know, Apple and the large scale companies aren't the only ones. You have large activist investors that are pushing large numbers of companies to actually start investing in environmentally sustainable energy, environmentally sustainable goals. And that goes to kind of the point that Kevin was making, that when you're talking about trying to convince people that what we're doing is the right thing, it's important that we're engaging with them, and part of that is that the corporate PPA gives the corporate the opportunity to actively participate in a market, and while delivering a consistently stable return for us.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Yeah, maybe we now move on to floating offshore wind, which has already been mentioned a couple of times today and is really becoming more and more important and yeah, really a big thing. And maybe, Tania, you already, I think, elaborated on RWE's vision for floating offshore wind. Could you say a bit more about, specifically in the APAC region, which markets do you feel are already well positioned for floating wind, and how do you see the future for floating wind in APAC?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think APAC, it's difficult to pick one market because I would say all of them. I say Taiwan, moving forward on the next rounds, we'll have opportunity for floating technology. Korea is well established because also because of the supply chain point of view as well. They have the knowledge transfer for their maritime oil and gas, and look at Japan as well, already thinking about floating, and Australia with Hunter coming up. So you see a lot of opportunities in terms of floating technology. And just back to what you were talking about, financing projects, and on the engineering perspective, how can we help that? And I believe you said about mission success is by delivering projects and projects in operation. So when we have more projects in operation, then we also get more comfortable, and the financial system also gets more comfortable with APAC. So I think it is all about a combination, yes? So we needed to also deliver on the bottom fixed projects that we have already on the pipeline, and we needed to make sure that we deliver on time, on budgets, so that we are capable of doing so, but also looking at the future. And I definitely think that floating, especially with the demonstration projects, and if you look back to, High Wind project and, King Cardine and our demonstration project, they are operating and actually more successful than what we thought it would be. So the operability has been quite good. We are seeing that on our demonstration projects as well. So I definitely see a bright future. I definitely see that a floating technology and combined with other technologies will be a massive opportunity for APAC to develop and be driving that process as well, especially in terms of already the knowledge that APAC has from the maritime industry. And I believe that we first need to see some of the commercial large-scale floating projects being deployed, so we can measure that success. But I definitely am 100% confident that we will see in a very, very near future. So we are very busy, at least ourselves as well. We have the commitment to at least have 1 gigawatt in operation by 2030, right? So, and I would say that from the pipeline of development projects, I personally think that's going to be even larger than that in the next couple of years. So when I look back, when I started in Europe, on the first project I did with London Array back on time in 2007, 2008. That was when I look at APAC, and now that all the discussions we were having back there, how can we get the projects through the financing? How can we get a financial investment decision? How can we get it through COD? And